on Australia's business channel. This is Mediaweek.
Hello and welcome to a special one-hour edition of Media Week. Ahead, News Corp to split its entertainment and publishing businesses. CZZ equities analyst Roger Coleman will be telling us how this will affect the Australian arm, investors and the wider media industry. As David Leckie steps down from Seven West Media, we'll hear what the company's Western Australia's CEO, Chris Wharton, thinks about the new boss, ex-Woodside CEO Don Volti. And we'll be talking to Fox Sports CEO Patrick Delaney after he cleaned up at this year's Astra Awards. But first to Fairfax Media, which is pushing ahead with its major restructure plans, even as its board and major shareholder remain in a standoff. Chairman Roger Corbett this week again denying Gina Rinehart a board seat over her refusal to accept the Charter of Editorial Independence. She's threatened to sell her stake if she doesn't get what she wants. This all came as three editors resigned, Peter Fray and Amanda Wilson at the Sydney Morning Herald and Paul Ramage at The Age, to be replaced by Sean Armour at the SMH and Andrew Holden at The Age. Well, in a moment, we're going to be hearing from the CEO of Metro Media at Fairfax, Jack Matthews. But first, to our special guest this hour, Nick Keenan. He's the Melbourne Head of Implementation Planning and Investment at media buyer Mediacom. Nick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
And we should just point out, of course, our co-host James Manning is in China, so he's on assignment there and will be filing some special reports on that next
Look forward
week.
to those.
Yeah, but thank you for being with us this week. I wanted to ask you firstly about the future of printed newspapers. What are you seeing in this, obviously in light of the massive restructures that we've seen at our two major publishers?
I think, look, the real question is what is the future of, I guess, publishing in terms of news and entertainment content? So the question is often asked, what is the future of printed newspapers? Well, we're going to see that the printed format is going to decline over time, and I don't think there's many people that would disagree with that. What has been set up, and we've seen a lot of the restructuring that's been going on, is setting up for the future to keep that level of big publishing, if you like, alive and well, but across a range of different formats. And, you know, often I've actually had one publishing executive tell me, you know, journalism is the cereal and the newspaper is actually the cereal box. And consumers have shown time and time again, in terms of the growth in audience online, that they want the cereal. They just it's the distribution or the box that it comes in that's fundamentally changed.
I did just want to ask you too whether, I mean, are the publishers keeping you in the loop in all of these changes?
Yeah, I think they've been really good in terms of, you know, when it comes to editorial changes and what they're doing there. They're not. It's not something that they have to keep us updated on. We can't expect to be told who's going to be the editor, because that's market-sensitive information that does not directly relate to advertising. But they've been very good with the structural changes that they've made that affect advertising and the way that we will be represented in the marketplace, and more importantly, how our clients will be represented in that sense. And they've been very forthcoming with that. And, you know, I think there's been all the right moves and good decisions are being made. The question which is on everyone's lips and why it's so topical at the moment is, what is the future? Because will a consumer pay for that content across multiple platforms? And that question, I guess, is about to be answered, because they're all launching paywalls.
We'll come back to this with you in a moment. I did just want to ask you one more question too, and that's this standoff with a major shareholder at Fairfax, Gina Rinehart, and the board. Is this concerning to media buyers at all, given that it is being debated so hotly? Is it something that, you know, is in the back of your mind that worries you perhaps when it comes to the Fairfax brand?
Do you know, first and foremost, the sideshow that's going on there at the moment, if you could calculate, which we can, how much money of free branding they've had about the quality and integrity of their journalism on what she potentially might do by not signing the charter and getting control of it, is in the millions of dollars. So let's just put out there, there's been a lot of, they've had a real free kick in the media, which is, I think, look, good on them. There's the Get Up campaign that's being very prevalent digitally at the moment. And it is talking about the quality of independent journalism and how wonderful it is. So Fairfax have never had a better branding campaign in that sense. Whether the board yields to her demands in terms of, you know, not signing the charter and getting control, I mean, look, in time, our only concern to advertisers will be if she did get control and then people stop reading the paper, then it's a concern to us. But until any of that happens, it's all hypothetical, and it's not a concern of ours or our clients. It's an in-house internal thing for Fairfax to resolve.
Nick, we'll come back to you in a moment. Let's get some more on Fairfax's plans. We can now cross to The Age in Melbourne. Sky News business reporter Nigel Freitas is with Fairfax Media Metro Media CEO Jack Matthews.
Thank you very much, Bridie. Well, Mr. Matthews, thanks for coming on Sky Business today.
My pleasure.
Now, some time ago, you wrote to staff about a trip you took to the UK and the US to study some media companies, and what you said was these media organisations were too late in recognising the fundamental changes to their business, they were too late in taking effective action, and now it may be too late for some of them to survive. That's also a criticism that we've heard about Fairfax, that you're only now addressing issues that should have been addressed some years ago. Is that a fair criticism?
No, I don't think it is, because, excuse me, generally the criticism that was leveled against media companies in the States and the UK was they didn't embrace digital fast enough. And Fairfax probably, I think it's fair to say, has the most advanced, both in terms of revenue and market share, the most advanced digital position of any newspaper company in the world for its market. So we were very early getting into the digital world back in the mid-90s, really, when the internet was still a very new thing. So I think we've been on the front foot, but that doesn't mean that we aren't still facing exactly what every traditional media company in the world is, which is a very powerful structural pressure as audiences fragment and as the business models come under pressure.
Now, some analysts say that the problem here isn't necessarily the business model. The problem is the product of journalism itself hasn't changed that much over the past generation, and the fact that media companies aren't surviving is because they're trying to do exactly the same thing but just with less resources. They're not actually innovating, they're just rationalising. Is that a fair assessment?
No, that's actually, I think, quite wrong. If you look at Fairfax, our audience is 30% bigger today than it was 5 years ago. So as audiences move across platforms and they go to platforms, generally digital platforms, that are really more consistent with how people consume media today, they still are consuming the journalism. They still respect the journalism. They still respect the journalists. And if our audiences, if that were true, our audiences would be shrinking, not growing, and they're actually growing substantially.
Now, as part of your restructure, which you announced last week, from Monday you're going to be moving to a digital-first basis. What does that mean?
Well, it really means that we're going to create and distribute our content in a way that's consistent with how people now consume content. You know, in the old days, and it wasn't that long ago, the news world was relatively static, and particularly in newspapers, was built around one big product that came out, and then, the cycle started again. Technology has clearly, dramatically changed how people consume content, and they consume content all day using different devices in different places, and it's really important that we have our newsroom and the rest of our business as well organized in a way that delivers content to them in ways that are consistent with the way they now consume it. So digital first isn't, let me just stress, a repudiation of newspapers or anything like that. Newspapers still are an important part of that, but they're not the only part anymore, and we just need to restructure newsrooms so they are capable of delivering content when people want it.
Is there a concern at all with this centralisation that's part of the one newsroom approach, that your regional and local newspapers, they continue to hold up well, but you will lose some of that local benefit if you do centralise with journos working across platforms and across geographies? Shouldn't a paper or a media company reflect the concerns of its local audience?
Well, it absolutely should reflect the concerns of its local audience, and what we're doing in no way is going to undermine that. We're sharing resources where resources should be shared. Some stories are not local stories. Many stories are not local stories, and there's no reason to duplicate the coverage of those stories across geographies. Other stories are very local stories, and you're absolutely right. It's essential that local media companies and organizations and products deeply reflect their local communities, and what we're intending to do in no way is going to undermine that.
Let's talk about advertising now. Advertisers still pay more today for print ads over digital. Why is that, and do you expect it to change?
Well, we want it to change. At Fairfax, we actually have reasonably high online yields, much higher than the global experience, and actually growing as opposed to falling. But it's a historical phenomenon, clearly, but there's no reason for it, really. The quality of an eyeball is the quality of an eyeball. And we're making an argument quite vigorously in the market that, 100,000 eyeballs on a newspaper shouldn't be worth more than 100,000 equally high-quality eyeballs on a website or a tablet. And I think, frankly, the market is starting to respond pretty well to that.
Now, you're also moving to a model where people pay for content, but even the New York Times, which has done an untried experiment, Chris Wharton from 7 West Media, who we're going to be speaking to later in the program, he says that you're going to struggle because you're competing against the ABC, who offer their content for free online. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it is a bit uncharted. There's no doubt about that. There's over the past year, we've been looking at the different models around the world. The New York Times model, which is similar to the model we'll be adopting, is it really a paywall? It's a variable height wall, if you will, and we can modify that as we see fit. If, for example, we set that at 20 visits, as the New York Times did, and until you hit the subscription model, that will only affect 17% of our unique audience. So it's not going to really interfere with the volume of traffic we get, and we don't think it's going to have any material impact on display advertising. It's difficult to compare U.S. models to Australian. The online display environment in the U.S. isn't growing still like it is here, so it's not clear that the subscription model that the New York Times has adopted is really the cause of any reduction in display growth online.
You've agreed to do this interview on the basis that we don't ask you to comment on shareholder issues like what's happening with Gina Rinehart and her wishes for board seats. But I wondered if you did have any comments on reports that Labor is considering to put in a public interest test for media ownership. Is that something you think is workable?
I don't really have a clear view on that, to be honest. Let's see what, if anything, actually what it says. I mean, that's a very broad kind of statement, public interest test. So before anybody makes too many comments, I suspect we should see what exactly it means and then have a better basis for making a comment.
And so according to some senior sources within Fairfax, the 3 editors that stepped down earlier this week, Peter Fray, Paul Ramage and Amanda Wilson, they were forced out as part of a power struggle between the print division and the online division. Any truth to those reports?
No, that's ridiculous. They all have made their statements about why they chose to leave. They're varying reasons. I don't think it's really useful for me to put words in their mouth, but those conversations with those 3 who are highly respected and well-liked went on for some time. They all participated deeply in the editorial review process. It's my belief that they all support what we're doing, and people do move on for various reasons. And let's keep in mind that the new editors that we've appointed at the Age and the Herald both come from newspapers. So it's not like digital people are parachuting in and running these integrated newsrooms. They're still being the editors-in-chief are still people who have very strong backgrounds in journalism. They come from traditional newspaper backgrounds, but of course they do they do welcome and understand this move to a more digital future.
Okay, Mr. Matthews, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Nigel.
So Nigel Freitas there speaking with Jack Matthews from Fairfax Media.